and welcome to another Battle Games in Middle-earth painting tutorial. It's been a while, but I'm back. This model is a favourite of mine, and it's going way back to the very early days of the game. And of course it is the Dark Lord Sauron. The pose here is a bit reminiscent of that scene in the Fellowship of the Ring where he's cooking up some dinner in Mount Doom wearing the ring. So I thought I'd go with a magma style base and some very basic object source lighting on it. So I started by just modelling it up with the cracked earth paint from Games Workshop, Agrellan Earth I think it's called, and I glued a small promontory of polystyrene rock onto the base with a slice of slate on the top too. I had a slate fall off my garden shed, so I thought I'd put it to use. From there I pinned Sauron through the slate, polystyrene and the base to make sure it's all in place, and I used a bit of the hot glue to stick the slate onto the polystyrene so that I didn't melt the polystyrene away. Then I crack on with painting by giving the metal one heavy layer of warp lock bronze, Sau one layer, to rule them all. Then I start work on the lava with a layer of bright yellow, sunburst yellow. I water it down a fair amount so it seeps into the cracks of that texture paint we base coated in black. Then I mix half and half warplock bronze and bolt gun metal or lead belcher and give the armour a heavy dry brush all over. With a quick layer of Adeptus Battle Grey, I dry brush the rock and the plinth he stands on. We'll return to that later to do the object source lighting as well. Then with Charadon Granite or Eshin Grey, I go for a fairly heavy dry brush on the cloak. He's the Dark Lord after all, but we want to get a little bit of texture and shade on the model, especially on that flowing cloak. At this point, make sure the metal has gone properly dry before putting a layer of null oil gloss on it, otherwise it starts moving the metal flakes around and it just looks dodgy. Shiny. Looks good. I really like this glossy paint. It makes that metal sparkle a bit and adds a lot of depth to what is essentially a very dark model. But I suppose he's the Dark Lord, so that kind of makes sense. Then, with the normal null oil shade paint, I pop a layer on the cloak, just to darken it that even a bit more. My logic behind making the whole thing so dark and not having very many extreme highlights is basically so the lighting works a bit later on and stands out a little bit more. Then with some orange, I paint with a detail brush into the crevices of the lava on the base. Water it down a bit, but not as much as the yellow, and just paint it in. Don't worry about going over the edges into the floaty lava rocks, just get it on there. We'll tidy it up later. But do make sure you see some of the yellowy paint shining through, because it's just important to make the variations for the lava. Now we go to pure lead belcher for highlighting that armour. Be sparing here, but make sure you get those cruel edges to the armour. You've got to remember, this is armour that has to look like it's pretty potent. He's a defense 10 monster. He's got to be hard to cut through, and that armour looks sharp, so it's going to sting if you try and touch him. And you can see I'm actually being quite delicate here. As I say, sparing, but I don't want this to look too bright. That's all, otherwise it'd completely ruin the effect of the lighting later. Using the same kind of technique as I did on the armour, but using a mix of Charadon Granite and Codex Grey, I highlight the cloak. But again, be ruthless with your highlights. Too much and it kills the effect. Just a little here and there. Then back to the lava. Then using some bright blood red, I carefully slide the paintbrush into the cracks. Yes, that was very much intended. Making sure you leave plenty of the brighter colours showing through. Then with Charadon Granite, I paint over the bits of floating rock on that magma base. Finally, using a bit of white and yellow, I dot the lather with some highlights just to make it look searingly hot. Take some extra time on this. I spent about 5 minutes doing this. This is 8 times the speed, but this is 5 minutes worth of painting. And it still looks a little bit ropey, I'll be honest. But keep dotting away, and if you keep sort of circling backwards and forwards, you can see what looks like lava. You know what it looks like. Just keep moving backwards and forward across the base and improving it until you think you've got the right effect. Try not to go too far, but I think more is less in some ways with how much dottage you've got. Now, here's where I start doing the object source lighting itself. I've never done it before, so I just gave it a go. If you're an expert, any pointers are very much welcome in the comments. I'd really like to try this again. But I started with a very light dry brush of yellow on the grey areas. I just basically dry brushed it properly, get plenty off your brush, just slowly build it up and build it up and build it up until I was getting to the stage where it looked brighter but not necessarily yellow. That's the tricky bit, it's the balance, isn't it? You still want to be able to see that it's grey underneath. Then I started working upwards, building that yellow up till it felt like it could feasibly be reflecting on Sauron's cloak, but not him just wearing a black with yellow highlight cloak. I tried thinking of having a reduced amount of yellow on the very front of the model, just above where that slate promontory is hanging over, but I might have gone a bit too far in the end just to make it look a bit more even across the model. Then began with orange, using the same process, but again, a little less, certainly less far up the body of the model, and then eventually the red in very small quantities mixed with some orange. But as you can see, I think it's just a matter of going for it. I was a little worried I was going to look too bright, and it was going to look too orange or too red or too yellow or anything. And you feel a bit silly dry brushing yellow over metal first. But in the end, it didn't really ruin things because the look is consistent across the model. I think it'd look weird if there was one patch of orange which looked a bit dodgy, but overall, it looks pretty decent as a kind of, once you step back and maybe do that while you're painting. Just stop, look back every so often, move it, to tabletop distance, and look. Does this look okay? And I think this works, certainly for a first attempt. So the lesson here is to just give it a go. It's probably not going to turn out awfully. I finished the base off with a bit more black on the rock floating in the lava, and then I'd do a few dots of grey before I finished, and tidy up the rim of the base as well. And that's it. That is another painting tutorial. Thank you very much for watching another one. I realise I've been a bit slow on doing them lately. I've been focusing very much on my podcast, audio podcast, Entmoot podcast. Search for it in all your podcast providers, on iTunes, on Podbean, on SoundCloud, all that sort of stuff. I do lots of tournament-based content and talking about lists and things like that. But I'm hopefully pulling back away from the podcast for a bit, and moving on to back into videos a little bit more, perhaps. We'll see what happens, life and all that, and these are quite time consuming to do, but I'm certainly got a few in the pipeline. Also, if you're willing to support me in terms of making more video, basically kind of a way of just saying, yeah, I'm here, I'd quite like you to do more of this video content, then I've got a Patreon now, so if you want to go onto Patreon, you can pledge a little bit of support, and we can sort of work out ways of supporting each other. There's a lot of stuff, more information on the Patreon page, but if you fancy supporting the channel and the podcast, please do that. Go and head over to Patreon. The link is in the description. In the meantime, thanks for watching.